anymore. We don't realise all the subtle things we do on a daily level. And midwives become part of that trauma, doctors become part of that trauma. We all get pulled into this institutionalised trauma and abuse of human rights. And, you know, it is risen on the world stage, it is risen on all of the professional bodies' agendas, and it has to be our #1 priority. Abusing human rights kills women. Abusing human rights kills babies, and abusing human rights kills society. Bashi, oh my gosh, she's just... Was anyone at the dance last night? Yeah. Wow, that woman can dance. And she grabbed the microphone off, she was a diva. But Bashi, I very first met through our midwifery group practice, and the very first time I remember Bashi, she was really pregnant with Connor, her 3rd baby, and she was sitting in our parenting network, and there was just something just magnetic about this woman. She had such an honesty and a rawness and an intelligence, yet a love that I had never come across before, and she had a baby with us. And then the tigress was awoken, and Bashi and I have regular little, we do like once a month or so, we every so often we feel the need to, but once a month we meet up at a coffee shop or each other's home, and we just get a Bashi and Hannah an infusion, really, where we pep each other up and we plan and conspire, and we're now writing a book together, and you know, the world's your oyster, and I just love this woman, and her generosity is incredible. So that's the personal part. Now I'm going to read you the official part. Bashi Hazard is an Australian lawyer and the principal of BW Law, a legal practice directed at assisting women and children in Australia, and a board director of human rights in childbirth. Bashi's represented families and individuals in coronial inquests, statutory investigations, and in commercial litigation. She's also worked on healthcare policy and human rights-based fact-finding reports, both in Australia and internationally. Bashi's background in competition and consumer law developed while working for several years with Allens in Sydney, immediately after graduating with first-class honours in law and economics from the University of Sydney. Bashi's written and spoken on issues relating to competition and trade practices law, legal professional privilege, the human and constitutional rights of free speech, and women and reproductive rights, particularly in relation to the human right to bodily integrity and informed consent. Bashi is mother to 3 amazing young children and teaches ethics, because she's got nothing else to do, to primary school children aged in our schools. And because she's got nothing else to do, she grows orchids. And if you've ever been to Bashi's house, it's like this, I call her place the ashram. It's like walking into this incredible ashram. And when we're talking and Bashi's children come in, I love the way she just turns and she just gentle smile on her face, and she just is completely absorbing. So, welcome my friend and my colleague and one of the most inspirational women I've ever met, Bashi.
Thank you so much for that wonderful introduction, Hannah. You know, there's a couple of important clarifications I need to make. First of all, I reserve that sort of beatific sort of look for my children when people are visiting. That's a fact. The second thing, and this is very important, apparently last night there was somebody who was doing, like, you know, crazy karaoke and twerking on the dance floor. I don't know who that was. I think Leona McGrath. Hey, look, there's some other people who are involved. Blanket denial wasn't me. Okay, now, before I start though, I think, you know, I'm going to take a little moment of my precious time to say and congratulate our amazing organisers and our speakers for this wonderful, wonderful event that's been here for these last 2 days. You know, a conference is a mammoth task to organise, and I know this from my own experience, but to be able to do that with good humour, with kindness, with consideration, and to make it look so easy, I think that's something to be admired. And you can tell from the amount of oxytocin in the air that it's been an incredible success. you all have heard over the last 3 days from really some extraordinary speakers. You know, I think I don't need to sort of say to you, oh yeah, sorry, just getting the hang of this. You know, I don't need to convince you about what normal and labour and birth is all about, because, you know, you've all heard from Judy the clerk, you've heard from Kristen Smallberg, you've heard from, you know, our very own Dr. Buckley. Well, actually, somebody reminded me that Dr. Buckley is a New Zealander, but like all things New Zealand, if they're good, we claim them for our own. That's the way it's going to be. So Sarah Buckley is definitely one of our own. So I guess, you know, we should get straight into it. And I'm going to basically start with what I know from the work that I do about normal. Okay, we know that around the world there are different definitions, depending on which country you are in, which region you're in, of what constitutes normal. And so we'll start with the Netherlands. Okay, when I read this book is by 3 obstetricians, starting with Paul Ruhr. I picked it up when I was in transit in Hong Kong, and to be honest, as I was reading it, I almost fell off my chair, because there were 3 emeritus professors from Netherlands writing about how in a system of care you can do everything you can to ensure that you preserve a woman's right to have a normal birth. Now, that is extraordinary, really, because we know that for all of us who practice in Australia, we know that that would never happen. Not only because there's sort of a blanket resistance, but we also know for the handful of care providers that support women's human rights to choose the circumstances of their birth, that if they were to publish a book like that, they would be punished, vilified, and probably excluded from their community of professionals. And I want to explain to you, and want you to bear this in mind, because this is one of the laws that have been set up to actually cause that to be a problem. We have in our negligence law what we call a peer acceptance defence. And this is actually, many of you will know about the Boland test, but this is actually, it goes further than the Boland test. And what it says is basically, if you do or practice in a particular way that is supported by a peer or a group of your peers, then you will not be found. It's an automatic defence to a negligence action, even if that person suffered a serious injury. Now, in the short term, for me as a lawyer, what that means is that I cannot stop, particularly in the private sector, the mass practice of inducing women and then pushing them to C-section because it's endorsed across the board. In the long term, what it means is that there is actually a statutory incentive for our care providers not to innovate, not to improve, not to change their practices, but to engage in the turf wars that most of the midwives in this room are probably very familiar with, and to use that to support their colleagues and their own self-interest. So, let me go back to the Netherlands. At its simplest, Dutch women do not label women by reference to their choices in birth. That's really what it boils down to. In the Dutch system, you can choose to home birth, 44% of them do. You can choose to hospital birth, 54% of them do. And guess what? You can change your mind whenever you want. Now that is, in fact, a strong tradition of protecting choice and human rights by reference to and for women. And it is that cultural tradition that we see underpinning what we're doing, you know, in terms of the way they practice, what they consider to be normal, that is what is actually enduring, despite the fact that we've seen and heard certain attacks and the research comes and goes. Basically what you have is a strong social tradition. And I want to talk a little bit more now about those social traditions that are unfolding in the world and what history has to do with that. A very good friend of mine who's Dutch and she told me that there was this wonderful tradition where if a mother was actually planning on having a home birth, they'd hang balloons out on the front gate to let everybody know that there was a woman in labour in that house and that a baby is due to be born. Is that right? What a beautiful community tradition to have, right? That friend of mine actually had a baby in Queensland, and as a result of that experience, she left her Australian husband, who still doesn't understand what happened when she was moved back to the Netherlands, I think, you know, it would be fair to say that she found us to be a bit of a culture shock. So it is this rich tradition that influences women in the Netherlands, and we know that, you know, it's something as simple as having a shared social understanding of the physiological and intellectual significance of childbirth. And that is what endures today. That understanding and protecting of something as important as the creation of spaces. You know, Marilyn Ferrer talks about that, about what's important to a mother, not what's important to her care providers. And it cannot be underestimated. And we also know that for the last 15 years or so, what's normal in New Zealand has changed. Our neighbours. And thanks to the hard work and the commitment of, you know, basically their government, led and initiated by Helen Clark, and some truly, truly amazing women advocates and midwives who've worked together to introduce the system. And yes, it is continuously getting attacked. And yes, the Murdoch press does have a little bit to sort of do with, you know, having a go at them, but the system seems to be enduring, and it remains the case that those midwives are vigilant, you know, in terms of protecting those services. I think one thing that comes out of that is probably many of you are asking, and I've heard you asking in the crowd, you must be wondering why midwives are such easy pickings, you know, when it comes to this sort of stuff. In fact, if you follow the Telegraph newspapers, like I do, and you might be forgiven to thinking that in Australia, UK, and definitely the US, it's the case that all midwives are baby killers, paternalists in skirts, waiting to rip those women's vaginas into shreds, and an attack, this is my personal favourite, an attack on the feminist right of women not to endure pain and suffering. And I hear this all the time, and in truth, this is nothing new. We know from the historical research conducted in the US and Europe on the decline of midwifery, some of the work by Edward Van Tailingen, that the extraordinary speed with which pregnancy and childbirth was medicalised, institutionalised and reconstituted in the US had a lot more to do with power and religion, asserting reproductive control over women, whether it be in conception, pregnancy or birth. And to assert that control, the first step is to get rid of their supporters. That's the first step. Then, a classic strategy of control is to isolate, infuse fear, and take control. And we know this, our politicians do it to us all the time. With that control comes the advent of profit-making privatised healthcare and the provision of medical insurance. The poorer the woman, the greater the control asserted over her reproductive rights. And what you end up happening with, in the US, religious drive started with the attacks. Attacks were always, it was supposed to be a witch hunt, but it was nearly always directed at the midwife of the village, usually the most valuable person in a village community. Women with fundamental and aged understandings of organic and biological methods of birth control and the management of pregnancies. These were the women who were attacked first, put on trial and vilified for keeping what was referred to at the time and in the books as the crime of holding women's secrets. Now, I want you to think about that because I'm going to talk to you about what happens today. This practice persists today. The highest profile case, which many of you have heard about, once Dr. Agnes Gerard, doctor turned midwife turned doula, Ashoka Fellow, who was charged with the act of providing unsafe maternity care services to women in the home, following 3 stillbirths, which the state said were preventable. Now, I cannot tell you how commonplace this is. Okay, around the world, a fundamental aspect of my work, what my colleagues and I are doing in HRIC, is to defend and assist families and midwives who are prosecuted or subjected to very public inquests for having a stillbirth, which is deemed by the state facility, the pathologist, as a preventable stillbirth. Now, in the context, because it's taking place in the context of the home. Now, even before these inquiries are conducted, or the case is even followed, these families are bullied, they're vilified by our newspapers, They're shamed by the AMA, apparently for making selfish choices. No, not that suggestion. Selfish choices, this is a suggestion. They are not fit to be parents. And putting a mother's mental health needs over the needs of her baby. And I've been in that situation. I've been in the courtroom when the AMA has been outside giving those statements to the newspapers and prejudicing my case and my client's case. And it actually is, in any other circumstances, it would be unacceptable. The fact that they get away with it, I think, is probably more of a reflection of how powerful they are in our community. And I have to say this, that we have medical professionals who are charged with caring for women. It's really the primary focus of their work. And they do not understand or accept that they are fostering a system in which we are asking women to choose their mental health or their physical health as alternatives. It is a completely unacceptable condition to live in basically what we would consider a first world community. I have lost mine. Yeah. So, needless to say, as a result of the trial and witch hunts, this is what normal childbirth looked like by the 1940s in the US. You know, this image was actually used to suggest that institutionalised care was cleaner, safer, with better outcomes for women, particularly the poor, who couldn't be trusted to look after themselves. Note the mother has been put under. Now, she probably won't see her baby for 12 hours. Look at how he's holding that baby, who, as a result of the general anaesthetic, will have to be resuscitated. This was considered safe and appropriate practice. And the US was not alone in its drive. In the UK, for example, and this is the way we track the history, Angela Davies is a historian in the UK who suddenly realised, as a result of her own experiences, which is like a lot of us, that, you know, social policy in the UK isn't all that, you know, we thought it was. It isn't just one of those normal things. There's a lot of politics behind the childbirth. So she went back and looked at it. The NHS was founded in 1948. Immediately after the Second World War, and because there was a growing recognition that they had all of these hospitals that were set up during the war that used to treat wounded soldiers and families and now are underutilised and under-resourced. And we in the law know, if as a government you're looking for an answer to a particular question, you need to be very careful how you phrase that question, and you need to know who you're going to pick to answer it. So the NHS picked consultant obstetrician Dr. John Peel, who, in the process of it, had a look at it and said, oh look, we've got a number of problems. And the first problem is that, you know, we've got this situation, I beg your pardon, I can't seem to find my slide. My pointer, it's disappeared. Dr. Peel looked at the situation, ran what was called the Maternity and Midwifery Inquiry. He decided that in 1967, 100% of births were going to take place in hospitals. Voila. And what happened? By 1968, systems were standardised in the UK. All women were being transferred to hospitals, and and basically everything was consultant-led, with the midwives doing what they were told. And that was the structure that took place. And what did the women think about that? Well, by 1970, they had set up the Society for the Prevention of Cruelty for Pregnant Women, which is now AIMS today. And if we don't think that, you know, the way in which our governments basically align structures, administration, funding, in order to skew things in favour of one organisation over the other, then this is exactly a fine example of it. And it is a system that we continue to see reinforced in Australia today. Now, from the government perspective, Peel is a genius, because he sorted out, he basically distracted everyone by making it look like the government was doing something about what was a public health issue. Serious poverty and deprivation after the war. From his colleagues' perspective, the guy was an absolute hero. He just made sure that all of his colleagues had employment in public hospitals in the NHS. From the women's perspective, by 1980, maternal mortality was down, but the single biggest reason for deaths postnatally from maternal mortality post-pregnancy was suicide. Now, this is what we see. And why am I telling you this? Because this is what is happening in India and Africa today. So in a bid to respond to all of the international maternal mortality, not morbidity, mortality goals, governments are getting rid of traditional midwives, often the only service available to women in highly remote or regional areas, and instead sending all women to under-resourced, over-pressured health facilities. In some cases, they didn't even get the memo. There are women knocking on their door and there's a caretaker in charge. So this is what normal looks like today in many parts of the world. A significant part of private care in Australia, most of the USA, most of South America, most of Eastern Europe. In Peru, we received reports and research that the process line of C-sections in facilities that run them up to 99%, sorry about the one that got away, is that it actually is now far more cost-effective for these institutions to bring women in, perform C-sections, minimum pain relief, send them home again. And that is what is becoming standard practice. And that is, and once again, I'm going to ask you what we think the women think about this. Right. Now, let me ask you this. You would think that with all of this extra control, because a lot of care providers say, you know, the women come in ad hoc, they want to change their minds, they do this, they do that, put a lot of pressure on us. We get cranky, we get impatient, we try to control them. So, let's talk about the South American situation where institutionalized C-section is standard practice. So you would think they come in, they're compliant, they get on a bed, they stay there, there's a whole row of them, they cut up one after the other and they're left there to recuperate. Complete compliance, and you would think in those circumstances, given the level of control by the care providers, that you won't have issues with abuse and disrespect. Far from it. Absolutely far from it. In fact, the issue of abuse and disrespect in South America is such a big deal, and Michelle Sandler talked about this on Tuesday for some of you who attended, is that, you know, there are organisations who are working on this issue, and they've got a phrase for it, and it's now being legislated against, and it's called obstetric violence. So I want you to think about that word, because I'm going to ask you about it. On the 28th of May this year, on the International Day for Women's Health, obstetric violence was the #1 issue that was discussed as a promotional campaign. 28 organisations came together, including us, and we developed this infographic. I'm sorry I couldn't make it any bigger, but I put up the main terms of it. This issue was discussed at Women Deliver this year under the framework of respectful maternity care with the White Ribbon Alliance, and it is the #1 issue with AWID, which is also another global women's forum on reproductive rights. Now, the reports we received and based this infographic on was from Argentina, Brazil, Mexico, El Salvador, Dominican Republic, Kenya, South Africa, and Chile. And of course, by this time next year, we will have plenty of evidence from India because we're already receiving those reports in anticipation of our conference. These are all countries with very high C-section rates. These are all countries where there is absolutely no recognition of the reproductive rights of women, and the over-servicing and under-servicing is being seen as forms of obstetric violence. And why am I telling you about this? Okay, why is there legislative change that's being brought into this country, into these countries? Let me explain why. These countries have GDPs that are about a quarter the size of Australia's. A significant proportion of that money is being diverted to maternity medical care, medicalised care. And then the resulting morbidity and the social impact on women and children is being transferred to the state. And the net effect is that it's crippling the country's GDP. So it's actually crippling these South American communities financially. The World Health Organization and the UN knows it. So they've started putting conditions on the funding that they give to these countries. And all that's done is at least shift the power internally so that the legislators have gone, oh, we can't actually do what the private medical people want us to do anymore, or we're going to lose some funding from the UN, and they've introduced the legislation. I'd like to tell you that it is because they respond to, advocacy from women. Unfortunately, it's not the case. It's really come down to talking about money, clear and financial economic incentives. We've already mapped that research in the US. We know that it's a no-brainer, and we're about to start doing that here in Australia. And we're not just talking about obstetricians. They're not the only ones to blame. It's part of a systemic problem. We're talking about anaesthetists, paediatricians, hospital administrators, pharmaceutical companies. There is big money in medicalised birth. And I want you to ask, I want you to stop for a moment and think about this, the word obstetric violence, okay? Because when I talk about it in developed countries, I get one of two reactions. The first reaction is usually, like, people literally take a step back from me. Because like domestic violence 10 years ago, you know, you don't talk about words like that in a polite function, right, over lunch. So it's not the nice thing. And it's taking some time, but the second reaction I get as I try and sort of then break it down and put them at ease and explain why I'm saying what I'm saying, talk about South America and talk about India, you can almost see the thinking, oh, it doesn't happen to us. That's okay then. So I want to take this opportunity, in fact, to tell you, and I've done this with full permission like midwives, about my attempt to have a normal birth, my third baby. Now in 2013, Professors Hannah Dahlen and Sally Tracy and others published this amazing paper looking at a massive population cohort study, 700 women in New South Wales between the periods of 2000 and 2008, who were healthy, low-risk women directly under private obstetric care, and they're 20% less likely to have a normal birth, significantly more likely to have a baby preterm, lower APGAR scores at 7 minutes, to need resuscitation, suffer jaundice, be readmitted for feeding, sleeping issues. I was one of those women. I was 32 years of age, I was healthy, I didn't drink or smoke except when I was misled at these midwifery functions. Basically, I had 2 C-sections because I was told that my body was a big lemon. And what followed after those C-sections was years and years of sick babies, hospital readmissions, loss of employment, marriage breakdown, 2 babies that were taken away from me for hours after birth. And I didn't know that, so I had difficulties breastfeeding, really difficult bonding period with my first child because we didn't realise how depressed I was, and so it went undetected for so many months. And years and years of postnatal depression. Where was my care provider? $20,000 later for each birth. You know, she shrugged her shoulders and she kept saying, your body just couldn't do it, right? Now, during that time, the pressure that me and my baby put on the social public system and the public health system was enormous. And thank God for it, is all I can say. But I've met thousands and thousands of women in the rest of the world who are in that position without a social health service to support them, and the US is but one of those systems. The very system that we look up to. So, I guess I didn't even really think about it. I let it go until somebody said to me, you don't just find yourself pregnant again, okay? Something's got to happen. Like Simon Hendricks from the ACM, I was like, hello. You know, anyway. Yeah. Boundaries. Anyhow. So, you know, this time round, I didn't know any better. I just knew that I would rather jump off a cliff than go back into a hospital. And I knew that for a fact. I didn't care what the outcomes were going to be. I didn't care about the impact. I just knew every day in my mind that if I had to knowingly put up with that trauma again, I was not going to make it. So, I turned to a lot of help, asked a lot of questions, and I found this miracle called a midwife. Yeah? And how that changed everything. So, I would like to tell you, of course, after that everything went well with the birth. But, you know, as Hannah said, a tiger was born. When I transferred to hospital, I was put in theatre without asking me and prepped for surgery. My husband was locked out of the room with my midwives. He was threatened, and I could hear security arguing with him as he was trying to call the police and banging on the door, demanding to be let in. As my body went through the throes of labour, I kept saying, I need to stand up. Baby's coming. I need to, you know, push this baby out. And I kept being flipped back on my back because somebody wanted to put a monitor on me. And every time I stood up again, the flipping me back on my back went harder, so that the message was reinforced to me that I shouldn't even bother to attempt to sit up again. They finally got that monitor onto me. Someone said to me, you know, your baby does not like what you are doing to it. And I thought, wow, how does she know so much about my baby? And, you know, and then I kind of left that. And then, of course, there was actually a young registrar who was standing on this side of me. And she kept just saying, Miss, I need you to sign this. Miss, I need you to sign this. What she was asking me to sign was a consent form to have a C-section. She didn't explain what was on that form to me. She didn't care. She just wanted me to put my signature on it. I kept pushing away and I got quite irritated. So at one point I said, you know, I'm not signing anything, I'm a lawyer. Frankie. And just like this, 3 seconds of silence and then all hell broke loose. Right? The door burst open and my beautiful midwife, my husband, came in. My husband was immediately, admonished and put in a corner and told to sit and be quiet. And fortunately for me, my midwife came around. She took a look around the room and she took my hand and she looked in my eyes and she said to me, prepping for a general anaesthetic, I know I'd never say this, I can't believe I'm saying this out loud, but you need to push that baby out right now. And so we did. 4.1 kilo baby. Someone who looked a little bit like a character out of Monty Python stuck his head between us and said, now everybody needs to get a grip, everyone needs to get a reality check. And I said to my beautiful midwife, I said, who is that idiot? And she whispered to me, that's a consultant. You better not say that again. I thought, okay, anyway, things kept going. And then when the baby came, he clamped the cord without asking. And when I asked him to unclamp it, he said no. That's how mad he was for us refusing to do what he had planned to do, which was to perform a C-section. And then at some point, the anaesthetist turned up and instead of giving me pain relief because they had to stitch me, which of course was because I had to push so hard because that clown was standing over me, he proceeded to go and stand over, so my baby was handed over to my husband. He proceeded to go and stand over my husband and shout at him for his insubordination. So I had to reach over and remind them that my baby was just a few minutes old and he was shouting over my baby. And then he stopped. He calmed down a little bit, but then the obstetrician was nowhere to be seen. Finally, when we needed him, and when I asked where he was outside dressing my midwives down and threatening them with deregistration instead of stitching me up. And when everybody left, my husband and I were sitting there and we both said at the same time, how often does this happen? Because this, my friends, was not a one-off. This was a well-oiled machine. This was not a system that's dedicated to providing care. This was a system that's designed to manage, push down and control anyone who stands up against it. And no woman, one who's poor, one who can't speak English, an Aboriginal or Torres Strait Islander woman, a refugee woman, no one stands a chance against this system, and it was obvious to both of us. And my role as what I do today was born in that very instant. And so, as a starting point, I looked at these questions. I thought, well, they were so brazen. They were so upfront about it. There must be some confusion. Maybe there's some laws. My husband and I were thinking, maybe there's some laws we don't know about. The government's just passed. We started looking into it. Do I have to obey a care provider who doesn't know the first thing about me? Whether I like it or not? No, I do not. Do I have a right to stand up in labour and to refuse monitoring, to refuse a C-section, to insist on being with my baby, to speak for my baby before and after he's born? Yes, I absolutely and unequivocally do. Was that hospital breaching my legal and human rights in the care that they supposedly provided me? Yes, they absolutely and unequivocally did. Now, one of the issues that was of serious concern to us is this is a premier teaching hospital in Sydney's most affluent lower North Shore. They set the standards. And we have some serious problems to contend with. And this is, if they were looking at it from that point of view, I thought this is something that's going to be a big problem. So, let's move on to the international instruments, because the rest of the world, how are we going for time? Lovely.
Have all day. Have tonight as well.
That's consent. So, now, our international bodies have been steadily talking about this issue for the last 10 years. It's getting to the point where you can see the national instruments getting more and more persistent. Okay, we've got CEDAW, the Convention on the Declaration on the Elimination of Discrimination Against Women, the Cairo Platform, the Beijing Platform, the Covenant on International Economic, Social and Political Rights. In 2014 and then again in 2016, the World Health Organization consulted with and developed statements, including with HRIC, about the right to dignified, respectful care throughout pregnancy and birth. It is a fundamental human right. But that just doesn't seem to get through at the state level. So now the Human Rights Council. So Human Rights Council is a body that is charged to go and basically look at all of its member states. Everyone has signed up to the Universal Declaration of Human Rights and just see whether they're complying with the fundamental rights with which they signed up to. This report was based on the USA, Kuwait, Senegal and Turkey. And, you know, given how much we look up to the US in terms of their privatised model of care, their obstetric medicalised model of care, I want you to think really closely about some of the findings that, you know, this report comes up with. And the other thing, to give you an understanding of how politically charged this is, you know, it's not often that the Human Rights Council goes away and looks specifically at the issue of discrimination against women in law and in practice. They're talking about health practice. And before we go, I want to clarify a couple of things. When they talk about health, the World Health Organization defines health as both mental and physical and spiritual health, okay? 1 in 6 women in Australia are now being diagnosed with postnatal depression, and that figure it's not stable, it's not plateauing. We haven't even looked at the extent of post-traumatic stress, you know, and arising from birth trauma. We need to look a little bit more into that because we think that actually Australia is non-compliant on that definition of highest attainable level of health. That is a fundamental human right, my friends, for all women and men. So, that's the first thing about the definition of health. The second thing, which they said unequivocally, is that it is the state's responsibility to ensure that they have mechanisms there to respect, protect and fulfil the right to health in law and in practice, including where the health services are provided by private actors. So when I see in the newspapers articles about, you know, our government or our state representatives saying to us, you know, you doctors and midwives, go away and fight it out and tell us what you've decided, quite frankly, it is a fundamental cop-out. It is actually a breach of their primary obligation to maintain and protect our human rights as women. So, I can go into a little bit more detail of what these rights are. So I've picked basically my favourite ones, the ones I like to talk about, the ones that we've been litigating, the ones that we're going to be focusing on over the next 4 to 5 years as our strategic plan. And I've highlighted the 2 that I'm going to talk about because I don't want to run out of time. I can see Hannah looking at her phone.
I'm tweeting.
Oh, right. I'm a tweeter now. Thanks to Sheena Byrne. Tweet that. So, Eugenie told us on the first day that mothers are very outspoken in defence of their rights. You know, where's Eugenie? Because I'm sure, you know, that if he had the chance, he would have asked me why, but I know he's a busy guy, so I'm going to anticipate his questions and I'm going to answer them for him. Because that is the kind of person I am. Look, is it because so many women experience the reality of being treated as a vessel when they're pregnant? You know, is it because the abuse and disrespect is so widespread that almost every mother understands what it is like? That subtle shift that you experience as soon as you become a pregnant woman or a lactating woman, that people stare at you if your child is not, you know, is crying too loud or not behaving right, or you're breastfeeding in public, you know, or you might have a sip of wine because you're pregnant. All of those things are that subtle shift, that subtle sort of sectioning us from being equal citizens into second-class citizens, you know. Is it because the trauma that women often experience in pregnancy and childbirth is often ignored, and this is particularly when child services turn up and plan to take that baby away from a mother who is declared incompetent or incapable of parenting because of her mental health issues? Who caused it? Who's responsible for exacerbating it? When are we going to look at that and start taking some responsibility for it? Make no mistake, we at HRIC consider the act of reporting women for asserting control over their reproductive rights during pregnancy and childbirth, before the baby is born, a fundamental breach of trust. It is a fundamental breach of trust. If you think that you are going to have an ongoing relationship with that woman and her infant for the sake of her well-being, good luck. You are unlikely to see her again because she will never trust you again. And I think we need to really look at that, because if we are talking about engaging women in our health services, building caring and trusting relationships, engaging with them at that significant point when they're pregnant, as Dr. Moberg told us today, that level of oxytocin coursing through their bodies, they're looking for social connections, and what do? We report them. I don't even know how to answer that anymore. So, here are the two key rights that I'm going to pick on. The first one, of course, is my favourite. It is the right to equal treatment and freedom of discrimination. Now, yesterday you heard from that famous and dubious dancer, that Leona McGrath, and Professor Sue Kildare, about the Birthing on Country initiatives that are taking place in Queensland. These women are inspirational to me, because I know that they are doing these pilot projects with very, very little support and recognition. The state is not taking up what is obviously a successful sort of model of care, and it's been endorsed elsewhere in the world. When I was in WA last year, I received a report that for the last 20 years, the limited role of the service providers that they offer to the regional women in Broome and south of Broome in WA is to hunt them down a month before they're due, put them on a bus, send them to King Edward Hospital, leave them in a hostel on their own because there's no money for family. When they have the baby, put them on a bus and send them home, even if it's in the middle of the night. Now, they don't have phone calls, so they usually land somewhere on their own and they take that baby and go home. If there are drug and alcohol issues, they go home without a baby. So, my friends, this is what the maternity care looks like, okay? A month before you're due, when you're reaching out for social connections and you want to be with your family and you want to nest, you are removed from your community, you are separated from your family, you may not speak the language, so you're put in a foreign place where no one speaks to you, you eat foreign food and you're confined to one space, you stay there for a month. King Edward Hospital does not have a great reputation as care provider. You go through that, and then at the end of that, they pack you up and put you on a bus and send you home. This is care. Hands up, who wants a little bit of this exemplary form of maternity care? Come on, hands up, come on, don't be shy. So why is it good enough for our Aboriginal women? Why? Why are we not respecting their right to body? Why is their right to cultural freedom and spiritual freedom not part of the mandate of the Western Australian government? Why? This is the last 20 years, we're talking about a time of economic boom. Okay? Now, I can only imagine how they're cutting the costs for those regional services. And what is the thinking behind getting midwives to do the job of hunting women down? How is that even a logical way in which to build a connection between a community that so desperately needs medical services with a few people who might want to do it? I can only imagine the burnout rate of those midwives and what they're going through. So we've decided, HRIC, to do something about it. And this is one of those few areas where we're not going to go from the grassroots up, we're going to go from the top down. So we've basically joined with a number of international organisations and gone to CEDAW and sought to have a general recommendation brought in for Indigenous women to recognise the inherent rights of Indigenous women. And as part of that, my job and the job of all of my colleagues in various parts of the world is to facilitate and reach out to all of the Indigenous communities that are interested in birthing and birth work, and create two specific paragraphs, paragraphs 24 and 25, which will preserve and recognise their right to bodily integrity and spiritual freedom, including the right to birth on country. And so, my next favourite is the right to autonomy. And you can see I've put the two main components of that right up. The right to refuse medical treatment and the right to informed consent. Now, We saw that amazing skit yesterday morning with the midwives, the student midwives, and I thought that was just the most clever encapsulation of how we no longer even look at the basics of informed consent anymore. We don't even know how to implement it into our health systems. And it becomes so common in the US that they use the words bait and switch, and many of you have heard about and heard me talk about the case of Caroline Malatesta and the issue of bait and switch in the US. That is where your care provider promises you one thing, you turn up in labour, and they do a whole lot of other things. Now you notice before I move on that I didn't say the right to refuse medical treatment being informed. And let me just say this, and I keep saying this to care providers, okay? If a woman tells you that the moon is in the seventh sky and Jupiter is aligned to Mars, and she's not going to agree to another vaginal examination, get over it. Yeah? Ask again, explain your reasons if you really need to, but then find some other way to support her. Do not harass. Do not repeat the request as if she's stupid or doesn't speak the language. Please do not bully. Please do not coerce. Please do not mislead. And please do not mislead her into believing that her baby might die. It traumatizes women, particularly when they find out afterwards that you lied to them. And what they do is they go home postnatally and they relive that experience, the moment that they felt when you told them their baby was going to die, and how they felt nauseous and crippling with terror and unable to move. And soon it becomes a point where you see a mother sitting alone in a space at home, away from the rest of the world, by herself with the baby crawling around at her knees as she's frozen, living in that moment and reliving it again and again and again. Is that care? Is that safety? And what is happening to that baby in the first 2 years of that baby's life, that important imprinting period when somebody's meant to be making connections, building communications, language, interaction, love, bonding? How can she? She's caught up in the crisis that you put her through when she was having or her. And so it is important. And the one thing that we hear from women time and again is that they really do know what they need. So they have this heightened sense of awareness, women in labour. So if they remember you saying something at some point and they suddenly decide that it's going to work for them, they'll remind you. They'll come back to it. And I hear midwives telling me this all the time. If you have had plenty of communications and discussions with your woman, she knows exactly what she wants. And she knows that you know exactly what she wants. Now, I love economists, partly because of my background. Emily Oster is a famous economist. She's really good friends with Stephen Levitt. He writes Freakonomics. And she had, obviously, like most women who collide into this situation, she had a baby and she was in absolute shock at the way she was sort of given misinformation, and what she calls, in economic terms, the information asymmetry of maternity health care, which means it's entirely one-sided. So, and she says it very nicely. She says, you start challenging them and they will say, one more smart aleck from mum, and the child protection register for you. Chum. Going back to the working group, and I'll cap it off nicely because it's an excellent definition of the meaning of a human right to autonomy, but in the context of state responsibility. I highlighted that last time because I want you to understand what I'm trying to say about the significance of treating women, pregnant women, differently in pregnancy and childbirth. Okay, so all of us are supposed to have equal constitutional rights in law, and that applies in Australia without a doubt. Men get to choose when or whether they want medical care. Full stop. They can reject it, no one says a thing. Non-pregnant women get to do the same thing. They can choose or they can reject it. They get to choose or they get to walk away. Yeah, there'll be some argy-bargy, but generally speaking, we've seen that happen. And last week we saw, in fact, the coroner talking about the doctor before who actually sectioned a woman against her wishes, and the family's wishes, getting really roasted for doing that because we take consent of non-pregnant people very seriously. Now, when you decide that when someone is pregnant, that you are going to bully and coerce them and presume to speak for the baby, and tell them that you're going to do things to them in order to protect the baby inside them, you have effectively made a decision to treat them as a second-class citizen. That is what happens in the law. We have no Good Samaritan law that we observe in Australia. That means that no one is responsible for his brother or sister. In other words, none of us are required to give up our body parts for our friends or to give blood mandatorily. There is no obligation, but when you do that to a pregnant woman, that is essentially what you're doing. You're saying, I'm going to assume that your baby has rights, assume that I speak for those rights, and elevate those rights over you, the sentient being with the equal rights in law that's sitting in front of me. And the implications for that is very, very clear. We are doing that carte blanche in every hospital around the country, a standard practice. And we need to understand what we're doing before we launch into doing it anymore. I have a really great case, but I won't tell you about it. This is going to give me trouble. I want to finish off on abuse and disrespect because it underpins all of the rights that we talk about, okay? All of the cases that I work on and, you know, all the rights that I sort of am advocating for. To be honest, you scratch the surface of every single one of the major litigation cases on maternal health, and what you see underneath is extensive abuse and disrespect of the family at the centre of the crisis. Okay, it's what drives their distress and their motivation to sue, because suing is not an easy business. You are trawling through a very traumatic experience. Most people don't make that decision lightly. Even before, you know, I pick up the phone and I say, Bashi Hazard, and they're sobbing on the phone. That is how difficult it is for the women who come to us who are making the decisions to put themselves in that position, and they know that the lawyer on the other side is going to sort of do the body shaming stuff. They know the evidence is going to be, you know, pitched against them. They know there's going to be some expert doctor who will come in and say, yeah, but she could never have done it, so, you know, who cares? And it is that emotional pain that drives the basis for seeking justice. And yet, we all continue to ignore it. We ignore it in hospitals, we ignore it in practice, and we ignore it in courts. You know, a significant part of my work every day is advocating for women who simply cannot engage in a health facility anymore because of the abuse and disrespect they experience. These women will do anything to avoid that again. And in Australia, we call them free birthers. And, you know, we chew them up and we spit them out. We abuse them and we compound the horizontal violence they've already experienced. We, you know, judge them in newspapers, in articles, and you can just see the online social abuse of women. But they're already so damaged and so injured, you know, for them it's just more beatings. Before you assume that free birthing is a first world luxury, let's talk about India. So this is Manju. I met Manju last year. Every time she goes to a hospital, it's hospital policy that she is forced to leave her children behind. Manju lives on the streets. So when she's in hospital, getting slapped and kicked and abused, her children wander the streets, including a 3-year-old. So when she lost the youngest of her children, Manju decided that she would stop going to hospital, and she doesn't do it anymore. And this is Shobha. And Shobha, I have a bit of a special relationship with Shobha because I went back and saw her a few times. Shobha, and I met her for the first time in December last year. She lives on an abandoned platform 9. And it's basically a big concrete broken slab. And she just had a baby 2 weeks earlier. And the midwife that I was working with on my India project introduced her to me because she found Shobha. You can see the green fence in the background. She was labouring quietly basically next to that fence one night in the middle of the night. And Shobha lives there. She has no access to sanitary napkins, no amenities, no food. She uses like basically discarded cloths and she washes them in the river that's just behind that green fence. And the water in that river is black with pollution and waste. And she uses that. And at night, a cloud of mosquitoes emerge from that river and just swarm Shobha and her babies. And they live literally 2 minutes away from a major city hospital. And it's a really well-appointed hospital. And as a homeless or a Dalit person, Shobha's actually entitled to go there and she would get a free meal, or at least 3 free meals, and a bed to sleep on, and probably some free sanitary napkins. And I said to her, this is crazy, you've got to go. And she said, well, there's no one, they won't let me take my children, they won't help me with my kids. And she said, the last time I went there to that hospital, I had a stillbirth because no one got to me on time. So she ended up basically with the baby dying inside her while she was in the waiting room. But she was nevertheless fined for having a 3rd baby as a homeless person. What she said is that they put the baby into those blue disposable bags and waved it in front of her and said that unless she paid the fine, she would never know the sex of the baby or see it. She would rather maintain her dignity and die. And that's what she said to me. And I went to see her many times. That baby died after I met her. So, we see this problem in India time and again, and the two big issues that are coming out of the contributions that we receive in India: abuse and disrespect, widespread, and the desperate need for midwifery. India needs midwives. They don't even know what midwives are. They don't even understand what their care can look like. And there are whole sections of communities. My view is, and I've seen this working with care providers like Janet Childbirth, there is a way to train the traditional midwives and incorporate them into the system. It has been done. Malaysia has done it. Sri Lanka has done it. And it comes from a position of showing respect to those midwives who've been providing those services and engaging with them, finding a way, using the resources to engage with them, which really says a lot more about women in that community than really about social policy. And also one more thing is that we're going to be launching the Lancet Maternal Health Series at a conference because we think India really needs to start a dialogue about evidence-based care. So this is really our dream, our hope for HRIC. These are the things that we would like to see happening. What would maternity care look like if it is supported? And it supported each woman on her terms during pregnancy and birth. Woman-centered care, culturally safe, community-based, healthcare anticipating needs, the variability in choices and needs. No more coercion, no more force, no more disrespect, no more abuse, no more VBAC bans just for the sake of care provider convenience. Removing the peer acceptance defence, and if I had one thing that I would like to introduce the next year, even in Australia, particularly in Australia, is a direct accountability mechanism for assault and battery of women in pregnancy and childbirth. Needless to say, we need an integrated system of midwives, lead carers, lead primary carers. It really, there is no reason why we could not have collaboration, as Dr. Alec Welch and Sally Tracy said, at all stages of care, regardless of the profile of the woman. Then you spend less time profiling her and more time serving her. So, this is us, this is our board, and we ourselves are very big on collaboration. This is a board of doctors, midwives, obstetricians, midwives, and lawyers and accountants. And everything we do is about collaboration. It's key to our values, key to the way we work, key to the relationships we build with each other and with our partners. We believe that if we set that example, it's going to work. And don't get me wrong, it's hard work, but we know that if we don't step up and do it, we're going to lose what we really value. We're going to lose you, again, as history has shown. And we will lose those precious handful of medical care providers that believe in the human rights of women, and we are not going to give up on that. I often get asked by people, how is it that you do, why is it that you do what you do, what we all do, yeah? And when I saw this quote from Maya Angelou, that one of my colleagues from India sent to me, as things got really tough as we're preparing for the work that we're doing over there. And I think it says it all, because every day I see midwives standing up for women and getting bullied and harassed for it. I've had women, midwives, stand up for me. They put themselves at enormous risk and they stood firm for me, and I am going to pay that forward. I will keep paying that forward until that bullying and harassment stops. All right, thank you very, very much.